I wanted to just give you some feedback on your biodiversity discussion, which I thought went really well. And the reason I'm doing this is because we're going to have 2 FRQs for our exam. Chances are biodiversity is going to be in there somewhere. Don't know all the specifics yet, but chances are there's going to be all kinds of FRQs just because they're trying to keep the security of the tests. But you can probably count on seeing something about ecology, which of course would integrate biodiversity. So I thought the discussion went really well. You need to obviously prepare the causes, the effects, and the solutions of these major topics. And I would do it in a clear, precise way, just like the packet that you have, where you have written it out. You can have that, or you can type it out. Maybe you can do some kind of slide, like I'm going to present to you, with some pointers, have a diagram, anything that'll help you. All right, so anyways, in terms of biodiversity loss, some of the pointers I wanted to talk about. Remember, biodiversity refers to the amount of species in any given ecosystem. So we're talking about ecosystems here. So obviously the amount of species in a rainforest is going to be very different from the amount of species in the tundra. But ultimately, each ecosystem has a level of biodiversity. The more species, the more biodiverse. Obviously, the way that we get more species is speciation. And so the opposite of that would be extinction. So when you subtract the two, speciation and extinction, that's when you get the amount of biodiversity. Now, biodiversity loss refers to then losing species. Okay. All right. In terms of causes, you guys hit it right in the head. You were able to identify the 5 major causes of biodiversity loss. You need to make sure you memorize these: habitat loss, pollution, overharvesting, invasives, and climate change. These are the terms that you should be able to use. When you use these terms, you want to make sure you explain the terms. Always use examples because that'll help provide the explanation you need on these FRQs. Habitat loss is the biggest cause, so that is your best bet to always use that. Examples: deforestation, of course, is the big one. Why do we cut down trees? Well, lumber, resources, but maybe you're clearing land for agriculture. Maybe you have to develop the area. And of course, there's, maybe you have to make a Walmart, and that would be part of the development. So always make sure that you not just identify that, you explain it. When you're talking about pollution, don't just use the word pollution. You got to make sure that you're giving a specific example of pollution. So you can talk about toxic pollution, like when we talk about heavy metals, like mercury. Even when some of you had already mentioned, like petroleum, oil, that's toxic. Waste pollution, whether it be sewage, whether it be garbage, plastic. Some of you mentioned eutrophication, so that would be nutrient pollution. Sediments, if you're constructing a house and you're building it and all of those sediments are kind of running, washing away through runoff, that would be sediment pollution. So all of those would be like really easy ones to go to. Some of you mentioned thermal pollution. That's great. Just make sure that any example that you're choosing, you're able to explain with example, and that it's also relevant to the question. So it has to be specific to what they're talking about in the question. Overharvesting. So if you're hunting too much without limits, illegal hunting like poaching, depleting any resource, an example, overfishing, tragedy of the commons. That's another example for the causes of biodiversity loss. Invasives, many of you were great at this one as well. So invasives can come into an ecosystem if that ecosystem is damaged or is not healthy, and that of course makes it more vulnerable to invasives. See, when you have a healthy ecosystem, it's going to be really hard for those invasives to come in. But if you have other things going on where the ecosystem's being vulnerable, then invasives can come in. So for example, remember agriculture, you have then, let's say you have cattle who are grazing the grass and they're plowing down on that soil, depleting and harming the natural native grasses, then that can make it vulnerable, and so weeds can come in. Invasives can also be brought in by humans on purpose, or accidentally, like the cane toad, for example, the python. You guys had wonderful examples with that, the lionfish. Make sure you're able to then explain that. And then climate change is the other. Warming temperatures, of course, global warming, ocean acidification, so anything that you would explain for climate change. So here are those causes. Most of you were able to identify effects. One of the things I wanted to point out is really be careful with some of the things that I saw in the discussion. So for example, latitude and altitude. Some of you thought that, well, if I change the latitude, obviously I would change the biodiversity. Well, if you're going from one ecosystem to the other, obviously you have different biodiversities. But the question is asking you, what's causing the loss of biodiversity? So obviously the rainforest being around the equator is going to have more biodiversity than the tundra, okay? But you're not changing the biodiversity. You're not losing biodiversity in either or just because you're changing from one latitude to the next, because you're literally going from one ecosystem to a different ecosystem. So that cannot be used. Here, when we're talking about loss of biodiversity, we're basically focusing on those anthropogenic causes. Natural disasters is another one. So hurricanes, floods, natural disasters are a natural process, right, in ecosystems. They can happen anytime. But if you have a strong, intact ecosystem, chances are that ecosystem is going to be able to bounce back. Remember, we talked about resistance and resilience. And so unless you're tying that natural disaster to climate change, so for example, global warming, there's more warming going on, more warm air, so therefore we're going to have stronger hurricanes, and that's going to decimate, the habitat. So that can be allowed because you're mentioning that climate change in it, okay? The last thing I wanted to mention, be careful with the fact that when we're talking about biodiversity, we're talking about the ecosystem. This is an ecological concept. So you have to keep it relevant to ecosystems, not human life. That's why remember, agriculture is a human activity. So agriculture can cause the loss of biodiversity because remember, clearing out land destroys habitat, and that's a major cause for biodiversity loss. But when you're talking about agriculture and saying that, well, if we have better agricultural practices, we can minimize the loss of biodiversity because polyculture is better than monoculture. Agriculture doesn't have an ecosystem in it. Agriculture is human life. So keep that out. Make sure you're careful with the way you're explaining that. Okay. All right. The effects. I basically try to give you a lot of the ones that I saw in the discussion, which are great. Obviously, you might have some more to add to this list. What's important here is that when you explain biodiversity loss, the effects of it, that you not just make a statement, but use examples to explain that, okay? So because species lost their habitat, they will not be able to have where to hide. They will not have their food source. They will not have mating opportunities, and therefore they can die, right? So you can't just say habitat loss leads to the death of animals. Explain how. So sometimes oh, well, it's obvious. Don't assume that, oh, it's obvious, I don't have to talk about it. Some of you mentioned eutrophication. That's wonderful. Well, eutrophication is nutrient pollution. It leads to dead zones. It leads to areas where there's no oxygen. Oxygen gets depleted, so there's going to be less organisms there. Heavy metals like lead, right? They biomagnify, and so they can accumulate into the tissues of animals and ultimately kill them, or they can also harm us when we eat it. So the effects, you can talk about ecological effects. You can talk about, of course, human effects. Human can be health. It could also be, of course, economic effects. So I mentioned over here economic losses, in humans. So be careful if they ask you the effects of biodiversity loss, then it can be ecological, it can be human effects, doesn't matter. But if they ask you for ecological effects, then you have to focus on the ecosystem. If they ask you for human effects, then you got to talk about the economy or the health effects. So anyways, I thought you guys did a great job in pointing these out. One thing I wanted to mention here, and this was like on the video from the Bozeman videos, ecosystem services, that is a great add-in. Some of you had mentioned that. Make sure you know that there's, provisioning, regulating, supporting, and cultural, right? So like when you had biogeochemical cycling, pollination, providing food, all of that, ecosystem services. You can even talk about K-selected or specialist species being most vulnerable to extinction, right? Because there's less of them and they have more specialized food or habitat. So therefore, when that is lost, of course, then they're more vulnerable to extinction. So make sure you read through this and notice how I kind of like organized it. This would be a great thing to have with you for your FRQ. All right, solutions then. You guys hit it right on the head. Regulations, right? When you regulate, let's say you're regulating hunting, setting quotas, obviously there's a great solution to prevent biodiversity loss. The Endangered Species Act, the Lacey Act is here in the United States as well, where it prevents the movement of endangered species or species between state lines. I don't know if you guys have been seeing The Tiger King, great documentary, I recommend it. But it kind of mentions about the Lacey Act, where if they're transferring, let's say, tiger cubs from Florida to Oklahoma without a license and without, basically the state telling you can do that, then that would be a problem. CITES, remember, is an international treaty where you limit the trade of species that are listed there. Ecotourism obviously is a great solution. Instead of killing things, let's enjoy them. Whale watching, for example, is better than hunting the whales. Many of you mentioned preserves, no-touch areas, national parks. So all of those were great solutions. So anyways, there you have it. And so I hope that you're able to review this and let me know if you have any questions. But hopefully this will help you better prepare. All right, thank you.